Welcome aboard. Welcome to today's flight. We are currently at the Governor Francisco Gabrieli International Airport, also known as the El Plumarillo International Airport, and it is located about 8 kilometers, 5 miles northeast of the center of Mendoza. It's the capital of the Mendoza province of Argentina. Today we are going to be talking about Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, also known as the Andes flight disaster, or known as the Miracle of the Andes. It was a chartered flight carrying 45 passengers, including a rugby union team, and it crashed in the Andes on October 13, 1972. We will be flying south from here and attempting to find the location of the crash site. Today we are back in the Cessna Grand Caravan, the 208B. Let me get the plane started, get the cockpit set up, and then we will take a look at the flight plan. We'll also take a quick look around the small airport here before we depart. The plane is started. Let's take a look at today's flight plan. The original route of Flight 571 was to begin at the Carrasco Airport, or known as the General Casillero El Berisso International Airport, which has the airport code SUMU, and it's in Montevideo, which is the capital of Uruguay. They were then to proceed to the Pudahul Airport, which is in Chile, and that has the airport code of SCEL and is also known as the Arturo Merino Benitez International Airport. Because of bad weather, the flight stopped at the Mendoza El Plumarillo Airport in Mendoza, Argentina. And that airport has the code SAME. From there, the flight would eventually continue south towards what is called the Planchon Pass, where the flight would head west across the Andes, then turn north towards Santiago Pudahul Airport. One of the routes used to cross the Andes flies over the waypoint ANKO, so ANKO, and that would probably be the path that Flight 571 was on. Let's take a look around the airport here, and then we will get into the air and talk more about the events of the flight and the passengers involved in the Miracle of the Andes. A look around the airport here. This is the Governor Francisco Gabrieli International Airport, also known as the El Plumarillo International Airport. It's about 8 kilometers, 5 miles northeast of the center of Mendoza. It's about 1,200 acres. Small airfield today, so a quick taxi. If this is your first time aboard, welcome. What I do is I find interesting places to fly to or talk about, and we find them here in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. We are back in the Cessna Caravan, the 208B. On 13 October 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force twin turboprop Fairchild FH-227D was flying over the Andes, carrying the Old Christians Club rugby union team from Montevideo, Uruguay. They were on their way to play a match in Chile. The trip had begun the day before, on the 12th, when the Fairchild departed from Carrasco International Airport, but poor weather conditions forced an overnight stop in Mendoza, Argentina. The Fairchild F-27 was a version of the Fokker F-27 Friendship, a twin-engine turboprop passenger aircraft that was developed and manufactured by the Dutch aircraft manufacturer Fokker. The Fairchild F-27 was manufactured under license agreement by the Fairchild Hiller Company in the United States. The Fairchild service ceiling, or maximum flying altitude, is 28,000 feet, or 8,500 meters, so the plane cannot fly directly from Mendoza over the Andes to Santiago. This meant the pilots had to fly south from Mendoza along the Andes, then turn west towards the mountains, fly through a low pass across the mountains, and then once on the Chilean side of the Andes, turn north and start initiating a descent into Santiago. We are ready for departure. Let's fly. It was customary for this type of aircraft to fly the longer 90-minute U-shaped route from Mendoza south to the Malargüe VOR, or navigational aid, using the A7 airway, which is now known as UW44. From there, the aircraft flies west via the G17 route, now known as UB684, crossing what is known as the Planchon Pass to the Curacao VOR, or navigational aid, that's in Chile. And again, this is via the waypoint Ancon, A-N-K-O-N. And from there, you just fly north to Santiago. After the overnight stop, resuming the flight on the afternoon of Friday the 13th in October, the flight took off at 14:18 local time for Mendoza. The pilots flew south from Mendoza towards the Malargüe VOR at a flight level 180, or 18,000 feet. The flight radioed the Malargüe airport with their position and told them they would reach the Planchon Pass at 15:21. The plan was then to cross through the pass to the Curacao VOR, and from there the aircraft was to turn north and start descending towards Santiago. The plane turned west and started flying through the pass and over the Andes. The pilots later notified the air controllers in Santiago that they were over the Curacao VOR in Chile, and they were given clearance to turn north and start their descent. And of course, that proved to be a fatal error. Some people believe that because the pass was covered with clouds, the pilots simply relied on timing to decide when they had finished the crossing through the pass, and that they had failed to take into account the strong headwinds, which of course slowed the plane and increased the time required to complete the crossing. Whether they were using timing or other navigational aids, they were not as far west as they thought, and as a result, their turn and descent were initiated far too soon. This resulted in the plane being over the mountains and led to a controlled flight into the mountainous terrain. The pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, he was an experienced Air Force pilot who had a total of 5,117 flying hours, and he was accompanied by a co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguara. Ferradas had flown across the Andes 29 times previously. On this flight, he was training the co-pilot, who was actually piloting the aircraft. The FH-227 was regarded by some pilots as an underpowered aircraft, and it had actually been nicknamed by them the lead sled. Given the cloud cover, as we said, the pilots were flying under instrument conditions at an altitude of flight level 180, or 18,000 feet, and could not visually confirm their location or see the mountaintops. While some reports did state that the pilots were relying on dead reckoning or timing their position, the pilots would have had access to radio navigation. The aircraft's VOR, the VHS omnidirectional radio beacon, as well as the DME distance measuring equipment, these instruments should have displayed to the pilot a reading of the distance to the next radio beacon, which was the Curacao. As they were in the Planchon Pass, that's what they would have been navigating towards. They still had to reach that Curacao before they would turn north. At 15:21, Laguara contacted Santiago and notified the air traffic controllers that he expected to reach the Curacao VOR in about a minute. The flight time through the pass to that VOR is normally about 11 minutes, but only 3 minutes had passed. He requested permission from the air traffic controller to descend, and the controller in Santiago, unaware that the flight was still over the Andes, authorized him to descend to flight level 115, or 11,500 feet. Later analysis of their flight path found that the pilot had not only turned too early, but turned onto a heading of 030 degrees, when he should have turned to a 014 degree heading. As the aircraft descended, it experienced severe turbulence. One of the passengers, Nando and Roberto, recalled hitting a downdraft, causing the plane to drop several hundred feet and out of the clouds. The rugby players joked about the turbulence at first until some passengers saw that the aircraft was very close to the mountaintops. When the aircraft suddenly dropped below the clouds, that would be the time the pilots also noticed the ridgeline in the mountains ahead of them. Passenger Roberto Canassa later said that he thought the pilot turned north too soon, and he began to descend to Santiago while the aircraft was still high in the Andes. Then, realizing what had happened, he began to climb until the plane was nearly vertical, and it began to stall and shake. The aircraft ground collision alarm sounded, alarming all of the passengers. The pilot applied maximum power in an attempt to gain altitude, but witness accounts and evidence at the scene indicate the plane struck the mountain either 2 or 3 times. The pilot was able to bring the aircraft nose over the ridge, but at 15:34, the lower part of the tail cone may have clipped the ridge. The next collision severed the right wing. Some evidence indicates that it was thrown back with such force that it tore off the vertical stabilizer and the tail cone. When the tail cone was detached, it took with it a rear portion of the fuselage, including 2 rows of seats in the rear section of the passenger cabin, the galley, the baggage hold, a vertical stabilizer, and the horizontal stabilizer, leaving a gaping hole in the rear of the fuselage. 3 passengers, the navigator, and the steward were lost in the tail section. The aircraft continued forward and upward another few more seconds. The Fairchild aircraft soon crashed on an unnamed peak, which is now known as the Glacier de las Lágrimas, or Glacier of Tears, on the remote mountainous border between Chile and Argentina. The plane had clipped this mountain peak at about 4,200 meters or 13,800 feet. The fuselage slid down the mountain about 725 meters before coming to rest on the ice and snow. Of the 45 people on the plane, 12 died in the crash or shortly thereafter. Another 5 had died by the next morning, and 1 more would succumb to their injuries on the 8th day. As we fly south, you'll see off to the right is the Andes mountain range. We are currently flying towards the Marlaguay VOR. The remaining 27 faced severe conditions. The chances of surviving in the freezing mountains at such high altitude are very low. Some survivors had suffered injuries from the crash, including many broken bones from the aircraft seats having been dislodged and all piled together on impact. We are just about to the point where we are going to turn west and go through what is known as the Planchon Pass. So I assume that it's a valley, or at least a pass that has lower mountaintops. Search parties from 3 countries took part in searching for the missing plane. Since the plane was white, it blended in with the snow, making it almost invisible from the sky. The initial search was canceled after 8 days. The survivors of the crash had found a small transistor radio on the plane, and passenger Roy Harley was first to hear the news that the search was canceled on the 11th day on the mountain. The survivors lacked equipment, such as cold weather clothing and footwear suitable for the area, or even eyewear to prevent snow blindness. They also lacked any kind of medical supplies, and the death of Dr. Francisco Nicola, who was on board, left a medical student who had survived the crash in charge of medical care. The survivors had a small amount of food, a few chocolate bars, assorted snacks, and several bottles of wine. During the days following the crash, they rationed the food in very small amounts so as not to exhaust their meager supply. Vito Strach also devised a way to melt snow into water by using metal from the seats, placing snow on it. The snow then melted in the sun and dripped into the empty wine bottles. Even with this strict rationing, their food stock dwindled quickly. There was no natural vegetation or animals of any kind on this remote, snow-covered mountain. The group would go on to survive only by making a collective decision to eat the flesh from the bodies of their dead comrades. And this decision obviously was not taken lightly, as most of these were classmates or close friends. In the book Miracle in the Andes, Fernando Parado, known as Nando, commented on the decision. At high altitude, the body's caloric needs are astronomical. We were starving in earnest, with no hope of finding food. But our hunger grew so ferocious that we searched anyway. Again and again we scoured the fuselage in search of crumbs and morsels. We even tried to eat strips of leather torn from pieces of luggage, even though we knew that the chemicals they had been treated with would do us more harm than good. We ripped open seat cushions, hoping to find straw, but found only inedible upholstery foam. Again and again I came to the same conclusion. Unless we wanted to eat the clothes we were wearing, there was nothing here but aluminum, plastic, ice, and rock. All of these survivors were Roman Catholic, and some rationalized that this was the equivalent to the ritual of Holy Communion, or justified it according to the Bible verse, "No man hath greater love than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Let's change our weather settings here for a bit. Remember, they were flying in cloud cover where they really couldn't see the ground or see the top of these mountains. Others initially had reservations, though after realizing that it was their only means to stay alive, changed their minds within a few days. On the afternoon of October 29th, an avalanche cascaded down the mountain and onto the crash site. The avalanche trapped all of the survivors inside the fuselage. 8 of them died in the avalanche. For 3 days, those trapped inside survived in an appallingly confined space, and since the plane was buried under several feet of snow, Nando Parado was able to poke a hole in the roof of the fuselage with a metal pole, providing them some ventilation. Eventually, they were able to tunnel their way out. Before the avalanche, a few of the survivors had become convinced that their only chance of survival would be to climb over the mountain themselves and search for help. Because of the co-pilot's assertion that the plane had passed the Curacao VOR, which was completely wrong, the real position was more than 55 miles or 89 kilometers to the east, deep in the Andes. But the group assumed that the Chilean countryside was just a few miles away to the west. The plane had crashed inside Argentina. Several brief expeditions by the entire group were made in the immediate vicinity of the plane in the first few weeks after the crash, but they found that a combination of altitude sickness, dehydration, snow blindness, malnutrition, and the extreme cold of the nights made climbing any significant distance almost an impossible task. Therefore, it was decided that only a select few would be chosen, and then they would be allocated most of the rations, the warmest clothing, and be exempt from the daily manual labor around the crash site that was essential to the group's survival, so that they could build up their strength. There were a few survivors that were determined to make the trek out no matter what. These included Nando and Roberto. Some of the other survivors were unsure of their ability to withstand the physical and exhausting journey out. Survivor Antonio Vizintin was also chosen to accompany Canassa and Parado. The group waited nearly 7 weeks to allow for the arrival of summer and with it higher temperatures. Although the group was hoping to get to Chile, a large mountain lay due west of the crash site, blocking any effort they made to walk in that direction. Therefore, they initially headed east, hoping that at some point the valley that they were in would do a U-turn and allow them to start walking west. After several hours of walking east, the trio unexpectedly found the tail section of the plane, which was still largely intact. Within and surrounding the tail were numerous suitcases that had belonged to the passengers, containing cigarettes, candy, clean clothing, and even some comic books. We will slowly make our turn here to the north. Again, not only did they make the turn too soon, for whatever reasons, whether that be the timing theory or they misread some navigational aids, they turned north, and actually the investigation said that they turned to the wrong heading, as well as heading north too soon. The group decided to camp there that night inside the tail section and continue east the next morning. However, on the second night of the expedition, which was their first night sleeping outside exposed to the elements, the group nearly froze to death. After some debate the next morning, they decided that it would be wiser to return to the tail, remove the plane's batteries, and bring them back to the fuselage so that they might power up the radio and make an SOS call to Santiago for help. Upon returning to the tail, the trio found that the batteries were too heavy to take back to the fuselage, which lay uphill from the tail section. They decided instead that it would be more effective to return to the fuselage, disconnect the radio system from the plane's electrical mainframe, and take it back to the tail section and connect it to the batteries, where they could then call for help. One of the other team members, Roy Harley, was an amateur electronics enthusiast, and they recruited his help in the endeavor. Unknown to any of these team members, the plane's electrical system used alternating current AC, while the batteries in the tail produced direct current DC, making this plan futile from the beginning. After several days of trying to make the radio work at the tail, they gave up and returned to the fuselage with the knowledge that they would have to climb out of the mountains if they were to have any hope of being rescued. It was now apparent that the only way out was to climb over the mountains to the west, and they also realized that unless they found a way to survive the freezing temperatures of the night, this trek would be impossible. It was at this point that the idea for a sleeping bag was raised. Nando Parado would comment years later about making of the sleeping bag. The second challenge would be to protect ourselves from exposure, especially after sundown. At this time of year, we could expect daytime temperatures well above freezing, but the nights were still cold enough to kill us, and we knew that we couldn't expect to find shelter on the open slopes of the mountain. We needed a way to survive the long nights without freezing, and the quilted balls of the insulation we had taken from the tail section gave us a solution. As we brainstormed about the trip, we realized we could sew the patches together to create a large, warm quilt. Then we realized that by folding the quilt in half and stitching the seams together, we could create an insulated sleeping bag large enough for all three of us to sleep in. With the warmth of 3 bodies trapped inside by the insulated cloth, we might be able to weather the coldest nights. Carlitos Paez took on the challenge. His mother had taught him to sew when he was a boy, and with the needles and thread from the sewing kits found in his mother's cosmetic case, he began to work on the sleeping bag. After the sleeping bag was completed and another survivor, Numa Tokadi, had died from an illness, the group was finally persuaded to set out, and the 3 men headed out over the mountain on December 12th. 2 months after the crash, with only 16 survivors left, Parado, Canassa, and Vizintin began their trek up the mountain. The oxygen was thin, which made it difficult for all of them, and it was still bitterly cold, but the sleeping bag did allow them to live through the nights. On the third day of the trek, Parado reached the top of a mountain before the other two. Stretched out before him, as far as the eye could see, were more mountains. At this point, he realized how far east they really were. In fact, he had just climbed one of the mountains at 4,650 meters, or 15,260 feet, which forms the border between Argentina and Chile, meaning that they were much further away from the green valleys of Chile. Seeing some valleys in the distance that formed a Y, he determined that that must be the way out of the mountains. Now knowing that the hike would take more energy than they originally planned for, Parado and Canessa sent Vicentin back to the crash site, as they were rapidly running out of rations. Parado and Canessa hiked for several more days. First, they were able to reach the narrow valley that Parado had seen from the mountaintop, where they found the riverbed of the Rio San Jose leading to the Rio Portillo. They followed the rivers and reached the end of the snow line. Gradually, there appeared more and more signs of human presence. First, some signs of camping, and finally, on the 9th day, some cows. When they stopped that evening, Canessa seemed unable to proceed any further. As Parado was gathering wood to build a fire, Canessa noticed what looked like a man on a horse on the other side of the river, and yelled at Parado to run down to the banks. At first they thought that Canessa had been imagining the man on the horse, but no, eventually they saw 3 men on horseback. Divided by the Portillo River, Nando and Canessa tried to convey their situation, but the noise of the river made communication impossible. One of the horsemen, a Chilean named Sergio Catalan, shouted, "Tomorrow!" They knew at this point they'd be saved, and they settled in to sleep by the river. The next day, Catalan took some loaves of bread and went back to the riverbank. There he found the 2 men still on the other side of the river, on their knees and asking for help. Catalan threw them the bread, which they immediately ate, and a pen and paper tied to a rock. Parado wrote a note telling about the plane crash and asking for help. Then he tied the paper to a rock and threw it back to Catalan, who read it and gave them a signal that he understood. Catalan rode on horseback for hours westward to find help. He managed to send others back to the river to bring the 2 men to Los Maitanes. Then he followed the river to a bridge where he was able to reach a route that led to the village of Puente Negro and then to the resort of Termas del Flaco, where he was able to stop a truck and reach a police station. The news was finally dispatched to the Army Command in San Fernando and then to Santiago. Meanwhile, Parado and Canessa were rescued and they reached Los Maitanes. The following morning, the rescue expedition left Santiago and after a stop in San Fernando moved eastwards. 2 helicopters had to fly in fog, but they reached a place near Los Maitanes just when Parado and Canessa were passing on horseback while they were on their way to Puente Negro. Nando Parado was recruited to fly back to the mountain in order to guide the helicopters to the remaining survivors. The news that people had actually survived the October 13th crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 had also leaked to the international press, and a flood of reporters began to appear along the narrow route from Puente Negro to Termas del Flaco. Those survivors remaining at the crash site heard on their radio that Parado and Canessa had been successful in finding help, and on that afternoon, on December 22, 1972, 2 helicopters carrying search and rescue climbers arrived. The weather was bad, and the 2 helicopters were only able to take half of the survivors. They departed, leaving some of the rescue team and the remaining survivors at the crash site to once again sleep in the fuselage until a second flight to the crash site could arrive the following morning. The second expedition arrived at daybreak on December 23rd and rescued the remaining survivors. We are just about to the crash site. As the eyewitnesses stated that because of the turbulence, the plane suddenly dropped below cloud cover, which gave the pilots a little bit of a warning that they were actually heading for these mountain peaks. The pilot attempted to make a pretty steep vertical climb, but obviously not enough power, and it sounds like the plane stalled. And the tail section was actually what hit the first peak.
From the moment I realized that there was something really wrong till the moment of impact, not more than 10 seconds elapsed. So it's very fast. And I looked through the window, and about 25-30 yards away from the tip of the wing, I saw this black and white wall rushing by at the speed of the airplane, mixed with clouds, you know. That took me 3 or 4 seconds to analyze. My brain then says, a plane cannot fly that close to a mountain. And then I tried to look inside the airplane to see where my mother and my sister were. And then that was the moment of impact. So I think that 8-10 seconds elapsed since the moment I realized there was something wrong, till the moment of impact. The instant of the impact is blindingly fast. I mean, this is the only plane crash in history. I think that there are survivors when a plane crashes at cruising speed and at cruising altitude. I remember in 1 second the roof of the airplane opening in 1 millisecond over my head, and then it was blackout for me completely. I was knocked out for 3.5 days. I don't remember anything else. And then I woke up and I realized I was in the middle of the mountains and on a completely destroyed airplane. It's almost 2.5 months over there at 14,000 feet, no food, no water, no rescue. So many things happened. One of the initial things that clicked the survival instinct was the radio that we heard 10 days after the plane crashed. We had a small transistor radio, and we heard that the search had been called off, that we were all dead. That was a very big turning point, which decided a lot of things. On limit situations, real limit situations, nothing gets better, everything gets worse, until you die or you're rescued. And that's what happened.
As we cross back over the crash site here, you'll see the location marked where the fuselage was, where one of the wings ended up, and where the tail section was eventually found when they started their trek to the east first. We're flying to the west. We're going to cross over the mountain peak that was to their west, the final trek out that started on December 12th. This is the peak that's about 4,670 meters or 15,320 feet, which was blocking their view to the west, which is why they didn't realize how far to the east they were. Once Nando got to the top of this peak, he looked out and saw all of these snow-covered mountains and realized that they had a much longer trek in front of them. And that's also when they decided to send back one of the three to save rations, because they knew they'd be hiking much longer. And when they looked down from this peak, Nando looked down and saw the lower peaks, probably the ones off to the left here, which were lower and were not snow-covered. And he assumed that the valley down below that led towards those mountains was going to be their way out. So they continued on, trekked down into this valley, where they found the river, the Rio San Jose, and the Rio Portillo, and they followed that, and it joined up with the Rio Ajurfre, eventually making their way down below the snow line in this valley to where eventually on the 10th day is when they would spot that Chilean horseman, or I think the term is actually muleteer for these men who delivered supplies, I guess, kind of like on pack mules. But I believe this valley below us is the river that they followed. They went about 38 miles, 61 kilometers between the time they left the crash site and the time they spotted the horseman. When they were up on that peak looking out at all of the snow-covered mountains as far as they could see, Roberto told Canassa, "We may be walking to our death, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me." Canassa agreed. "You and I are friends, Nando. We have been through so much. Now let's go die together." And they followed that ridge towards the valley and then descended down into that valley that we're over. And that small patch below us, the green and brown spot that looks like a small field, that is roughly where they indicated that they saw the horsemen based on some maps that they marked after they were rescued. And that's where across the river they saw Sergio Catalan. And then from there, as we know, they were rescued the next day and brought back by some other horsemen. And then that's when word finally got out that there was actually survivors from Flight 571, and it was truly a miracle. Well, that was a little bit about Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, or Miracle in the Andes. Now it is time for us to make our way north. We will make our way to the Santiago Putahul Airport, airport code SCEL. The cost of today's tour is simple. If you could just reach down and hit that subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. It also helps the channel. If you know anybody else that might be interested in these flights, please share the channel with them. Let's make our way to the airport, get the aircraft back on the ground. We will take a look around the airport once we're there. We are on the ground. Welcome to Santiago, Chile. Let's find a place to park the aircraft. We'll get it shut down. We'll send the drone up, take a look around this airport.